Hello again. I hope everyone has had a little bit of time to restore your health and get some food and get some warmth and get some sun and talk to each other. This has been a wonderful opportunity. We did order the weather. We didn't order internal climate temperature that will satisfy everyone. So I know it was a bit too hot before, might be too cold now. You'll just have to blame the person beside you, depending on how you look at that. I'm very honored today to introduce Lena Kilsson-Holm as our second keynoter. Lena is Greenlandic from Qaqortoq, and she's at the Greenland Climate Research Center and Climate and Society Group. She's a research scientist. She's been involved in policy. She's been with the ICC in the past. She has been working in interdisciplinary science and also looking at ways in which we question and problematize the terms that get used for traditional environmental knowledge and indigenous knowledge, and thinking about the roles through which communities, individuals, and researchers work when those boundaries blur so much between all of us at this point. She's also an extremely nice person. I have to say, she has been with us for the past few days, and I feel personally blessed just to be able to have gotten to know her, and hope that these are the kinds of collaborations and friendships that will develop amongst all of us as we go along, and if so, then this whole process will have been worth it on many, many levels. I am going to avoid trying to read the title of her talk, except for the last part, Building New Knowledge from the Arctic by the Method of Knowledge Co-Production, because by the fact that I do not know how to pronounce it, I have already shown why we need to collaborate and why we need to work together in better ways. And so for my own education and for all of yours, and to help us understand a bit better the concept of co-production of knowledge, I want to introduce Lena Kilsson-Holm.
Thank you. Qujanaq. I've been looking forward to being here with you. Traveling from Greenland to the US is not always easy, but this time we were able to go only through Keflavik, Iceland, and not through Denmark and stay there for an overnight and then go 8 hours or 6 hours. But I'm happy to be here, and from the morning session, all the statements that were done made me a little nervous, because a lot of the things that I'm gonna say will be kind of a repetition of what has been said until now, but hopefully I will also bring some more other insights and some other angles to what has already been said. Inuiortamasi. As Ken said, my name is Kevin Lene Kilsson-Holm, and I am from Qaqortoq, working as researcher and project leader at the Greenland Climate Research Center, based at Bingortstederifik, Greenland Institute of Natural Resources. I will spend some time in sharing with you my own ideas on the issues related to the headlines of my presentation. In the past few years, there has been a movement away from the concept of traditional knowledge and traditional ecological environmental knowledge, known as TEK, and work has been done to introduce, to my opinion, a better concept, illustrating the knowledge of indigenous peoples of the Arctic in a more flexible and understandable way. This will, to my opinion and from my own experience, lead to a smoother way of building collaboration among different ways of knowing, which could be the Western way of science and Arctic indigenous knowledge. The inclusion of the insightful knowledge and wisdom that our people have about the environment of the Arctic will not only benefit the scientific research done in the Arctic, but also the peoples of the Arctic. So in the next few days, and it already started, we will look into how best we can do that. Sida assetletuk, the Sida, the mind have twisted, meaning also the Sida, the outdoors have twisted. Allanginnam Sida assetletuk. Tassam allangoriarterna soorlu sarfap idummut kuutorsuasiip kinginerisaanik aalisagaaranguaningaaniit aalisagakuluunut tamakkiivillitik qaangiikkaluarpu soorlu aalisagarpas suasiit taagersinnaavarput saarillinningaaniit kigitilinnut nataarnat suluppaakat qalerallit ammassassivit kanassit tamaksoorl uukkat. Yes, the changes, like when the current changed direction, going from the ocean inwards land, all our fishes, from the smallest ones to the biggest ones, disappeared. The fish species of question are cod, wolffish, halibut, redfish, Greenland halibut, capeline, herring, sculpin, and polar cod. This is an elder from Nassamit, almost on the southern tip of Greenland, telling one project I was running called Sida Inuk about how he has been experiencing the changes over time in his lifetime, seeing that because the ocean currents were changing, all the animals that used to be there, they must have disappeared to somewhere else. And further he says that tessa tamakku allanguutit inip madersugai qangaaniilli. Sidami madersorlugu aama nadeqartarput tamarmik. These changes are what the human beings have been following from the time past, and following the Sida has a crucial effect on human being. Henrik Enoksen, that's his name, Interik from Nassammi. Linguistic skills are of great importance for a constructive and inclusive collaboration, not only in order to have conversation with community members, but also in order to understand their universe and their understanding of their environment, whether it is about how they perceive their own existential questions, but also in accordance with where they are, dialects and local conditions, and what they are making a living from. For instance, fishermen, what kind of fish are they fishing for? Hunters, what kind of animals are they hunting? Farmers, farming or what? And so on. Recognize that we have indigenous knowledge is very important, and our indigenous knowledge has monitoring methodologies also. Understanding our way of seeing the world and our language helps you to begin to understand that our knowledge is systematic and brings together different pieces of our environment. This is what we need. Scientists need to bring natural and social together. Indigenous knowledge can help scientists learn how to do that. Integrating interdisciplinary approach within the natural and social scientific research and indigenous knowledge for policy development in the 21st century is of immense importance to the global crisis. Here, the views of the indigenous peoples can and will have a key role that we cannot put the blind eye towards. Collaboration is not only about information sharing, it is about a process that allows us to share knowledge. The concept of knowledge co-production will have a great importance to the future results of research. To reach this, we need to, quote, develop capacity building for and educate people about co-production of knowledge, an approach that builds equitable and collaborative research partnerships from different ways of knowing. This is a quote is taken from the last Arctic Observing Summit meeting in Fairbanks, and it is taken from recommendations made there. In the past few years, there has been a movement away from the concept of tech, which I already mentioned. And this will, to my opinion and from my own experience, lead to a smoother way of building collaborations among different ways of knowing. The inclusion of the insightful knowledge and wisdom that our people have about the environment of the Arctic will not only benefit the scientific research done in and about the Arctic, but also benefit the peoples of the Arctic. In the joint statement from the recent US and Nordic Leaders Summit, it says about the Arctic: we are committed to deepen the knowledge and understanding of the Arctic, both inside and outside the region, to strengthen Arctic research and transdisciplinary science and encourage it's a hard word, cooperation between higher education institutions and society, as well as synergies between science and traditional and local knowledge. And this happened only 10 days ago or maybe 2 weeks ago, and I'm happy that the Nordic leaders committed to do such a statement, which is very new to my experience. And I hope that, for instance, the Greenland government will also listen to this, what the leaders were talking about at this summit, not only on the Arctic, but also on the world situation. But of course, especially with the Arctic as a focal point. To see our knowledge as equitable to science requires trust, relationship building, capacity building, allowing for multiple directions, and overall a paradigm shift in how we are monitoring, how we are doing research, and how we are working together. Key here is not translating one knowledge into the other. Both knowledge systems has to be respected for what they are, and they must be considered equal for obtaining the best results. It is important to have both knowledge holders in the process from conception through to analysis and output. Not all research will need both indigenous knowledge and science, Western scientific knowledge. The dissemination of the scientific results will always have utmost importance for the Arctic residents in their thriving for understanding the environmental changes happening in their region, though. Both the non-conventional educated, which is hunters, fishermen, and others with a unique to the indigenous people's knowledge, and conventional educated who are academics will have to rethink their way of understanding the entities surrounding them. I think this will have much more powerful results than what we have today. This, of course, will have implications of how we conduct research today, but again, I think that is the only way to go. We have to include children and youth, and today is the Children's Day in Greenland, and I congratulate all the children and hope that they will have a nice day with their families and other children as well. And we have to include them by being good examples of how we do, for instance, community-based research. They have to be reintroduced to their own culture, since this is the cause for the survival of our peoples. This is to be understood that based on how our cultures have been developing through millennia and the tools that our people have invented, that meant that we are still living in the harsh Arctic environment. Here, us as researchers and scientists, policymakers, funders, and educational institutions and others have a responsibility to help out, since we have the resources and we have the knowledge that can help out in these endeavors. Human relationships in research. Consultation is important, but engaging with communities prior to even writing a research proposal is vital to the research process. Community members need to be research partners and feel they have part ownership of the project. They must be able to discuss research topics and issues and contribute to the formulation of research questions. For more people to benefit from science, it's also very important to consult with communities when choosing parameters for what to measure. Today we often see that inappropriate choices of parameters are making the beneficiary of research very limited, many times only to the research and not to the communities. Often such research have been developed within some very narrow entities where, when the communities finds out what it is all about, we are told that the researchers would have the same results, maybe even better, if they had been consulted, if they have, the communities have been consulted. And at the same time, that research would have been to the benefit for the community as well. Many times research, especially in the Arctic, are to a great extent cost and resource consumptive. If we can turn this trend into multiple beneficiary research that would make the results better and create sustainable programs. We have throughout the modern history been lending our environment to the humanity through giving researchers free hand to do whatever they find interesting for free. And I think that we have reached a point where this has to be turned into multiple beneficiary research. And of course, many communities have their own research priorities, and many are interested in conducting their own research project independently. There are communities that are interested and well able to do this on all kinds of topics. There needs to be funding to communities directly for these kinds of efforts. Funding directly to communities without putting conditions on them or tie them to someone else's research agenda. Many communities want to have ownership and leadership of the research process, in other words, to conduct their own research process. And in this way, we can help out in decolonizing science. The measuring of a fjord, for instance, by an oceanographer and by biologists going out to do samples in the fjord, and the locals working together would be a good platform for co-production of knowledge. Since these are the locals are making a living from hunting and fishing the resources, and since they have a lot knowledge about the system holistically that has been handed to them through generations. The Inuit living in these places knows a lot about the weather conditions, the ice conditions, the currents in the area, the cycles of animals, the contents of the stomachs of the animals they catch, the tastes of the meat according to where and when these has been caught, just to mention a few. Community-based research works best when community members have a major role in the actual work that produces the data, and when they apply the results of that research in everyday context. And this kind of research is not simply a matter of scientists employing local people to help them transport equipment or work as research assistants. Community-based research requires an element of capacity building in terms of local training and guided by the community leaders. And community-based research needs to be sustained on a long-term basis. Research projects have a specific period of funding, but community needs often extend beyond the lifetime of a project. Information and data needs to be accessible to communities, but in a way in accordance to their culture, to address different questions. Nevertheless, they also have to know how it is being used outside of their community. For me, a true community-based research is the one using free, prior, and informed consent. Free, since the community has always the right to say no. This in accordance with the international rights that indigenous peoples have achieved through hard work, through international cooperation amongst indigenous and governmental institutions and states. The plans for the research has has to be announced to the right institutions of the communities prior to the initiation of such a research project, in order for them to take part of it on an equal basis with those that want to do research in the areas of the communities in question. And last but not least, it has to be on an informed consent approach. Informed means that the community has all the given information they need in order for them to make a decision. This includes how information gathered will be used, stored, and what it will be used for. The community in question have the right to approve such plans, since they will be the ones that will have the right to review the plans and the results in accordance with the before mentioned internationally achieved rights. This is a good reason to have regional protocols so that communities can define what free, prior, and informed consent will require from them, what they will need. At the U.S. Nordic Leaders Summit, it says further, the United States and the Nordic countries are committed to recognize the rights of the indigenous and local peoples, and we reaffirm our commitment to the unique role played by Arctic indigenous and local communities and their traditional and local knowledge. It is as if the sida has twisted, and my hope is that we at last are reaching to the point where we are thriving for the twisting of our minds into the direction for a sustained way of doing Arctic research in regards of developing methodologies that fulfill the interest of all, be it the indigenous peoples of the Arctic and the Arctic scientific community. Qujanaq. So, questions, comments are welcome.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm thinking about your discussion of the co-production of knowledge, and particularly interesting this idea. Thank you. Particularly interesting this idea that that different ways of knowing ought to be made equal and equal partners in any sort of endeavor. I'm wondering if it's ever appropriate to determine that one or another way of knowing might be a more effective or appropriate way to address a particular problem, whether that be an indigenous way of knowing or approach to a problem, or a sort of more Western scientific approach, or if the principle of kind of equal standing in terms of ways of knowing precludes the elevation of one or another approach to a problem over another in a particular context. Thank you.
I think that is very the essence of what we are trying to do. And I'm also saying here that all Arctic research or science doesn't need to have both ways of knowing in it, because we admit that Western scientific knowledge can be so far away from the way that indigenous peoples are understanding their own world, that including this or intertwining those different ways of knowing would be meaningless. But I think that it will always be the communities, but also both the scientific community, but also the indigenous communities and local communities to decide to which, to which extent to use and work together these different ways of knowing. Aimela.
Thank you also. That was a lovely talk. I wonder if you have any examples that you could talk to us about what you envision as best practice. You know, what are some good models that you've experienced where this kind of co-production of knowledge has worked, or in which the researchers have worked well with the community from a community's perspective?
In former times, I'm based in Nuuk, and nearby Nuuk there is a huge fjord system that the Institute of Natural Resources has also been working a lot from, both biologically but also oceanography and glaciology. And I have been trying to collaborate, make a collaboration between the project that we ourselves as social scientists are doing together with people who are living in the fjord and who has been abroad in this environment, to bring their knowledge with the biological scientists at our institute. And I must say it is still very hard for the natural scientists to understand the concepts that we are working with in Greenland. But I know in other places in the Arctic, bridges have been made to advocate for collaboration and co-production of knowledge approach, working from this concept. But my wish is, of course, that we, with the work that we are doing, all of us, will come nearer to such approaches in the near future. With the National Science Foundation funded almost 100%, I have been part of a project which is called Siku Inuit Hira, where we brought hunters from Alaska, Canada, and Greenland together, together with academia to study sea ice. They're making a life out of the sea ice. And there is a book that came from this project called The Meaning of Ice. And in that you can see that there is so much knowledge out there that with a method of co-production of knowledge could bring Western scientific knowledge together with the people living out there, which has a lot of different knowledges about different things, like people who are good in weather forecasting, and people who knows how the seals are traveling around their environment and how these have been changing. I think that if we could ask all the biologists, for instance, to read that book and try to think their own way of thinking their science being done into the way that is said and presented in the book, that would make a ground for collaboration and co-production of knowledge.
It's wonderfully important, the whole notion of indigenous contributions to knowledge. But so far it seems, not in your talk, but in general, so far it seems that the major interest in indigenous knowledge is in indigenous knowledge about the kinds of things the West wants to know about: climate change, glaciology, sea changes, et cetera, et cetera. I see very little interest in indigenous knowledge. For instance, if you dehomogenize the native communities, if you say, okay, it's not the Inuit or this Inuit community, but you make it less homogenous, I see almost no interest, for example, in women's knowledge of how to deal with increasing domestic violence. I mean, nobody seems to be asking, what's the indigenous women's knowledge of how you cope with this intensifying and intensifyingly violent domestic violence? So we're not, and I wanted to ask you about the possibilities for this. Also, I wanted to ask you about the possibilities for an engagement with indigenous knowledge where neither they nor us seem to know what the hell is happening. For example, suicide. One of the startling things is you go into an indigenous community and they say, God knows what's happening here. We have no idea of causes. And the scientific community has no idea of causes. So perhaps in addition to this wonderful cooperations that you're mentioning, we could figure out how we engage when neither of us know the answer. And I was wondering if you have any suggestions on that problem also.
My presentation is very much based on the environment and how we are using the resources and the climate as a starting point. But I have also been studying history, so I know that the Greenlandic people have been colonized since 1721, and our way of thinking, the social structures that were among our peoples have been changed very rapidly since the renewal of the colony of Greenland, for instance. When Greenland became equal part of Denmark, everybody were becoming considered Danes, but nobody were talking about that Greenlanders cannot become Danes and with this mind of the Europeans overnight. But a lot of people were moved into the bigger towns or settlements and cities where they were lifted from the ground and just living in the air. Maybe I can illustrate it that way. And our school system is very much based on the European school system. We didn't learn about our own culture when we went to school. And I think when people were living in their own known environment that also defined their identities and moved away from these settlements and places, maybe they left their identity with that place and had a hard time in coping with the new identity that has to be built, and they didn't get any help in achieving that. In Greenland, there is a great discussion and has been for many years since the University of Greenland were formed about these issues, about violence at home and other places, suicide, and work has been done, maybe not beginning with the government, but on grassroots basis. And today I think we are reaching the place where government is seeing that this is very important, because these are resourceful people and we need all the resources to have a good society and good community in Greenland. No?
Thanks, Lena, for your talk. I wanted to ask you about your comment about involving children and youth in research, because first of all, I appreciated you bringing children into the equation, because usually we hear about youth but not children. And I also was intrigued by Children's Day and wondered what that looked like, and thought about how I don't think we have a Children's Day in the United States. But I am curious in particular because I think in the Arctic context, a lot of times when youth are involved in research, it's often done in a way where there's emphasis on transmission of knowledge from elders to youth, but that knowledge of youth and children is not necessarily considered knowledge in its own right. And so I'm curious, in the context of co-production of knowledge, if you could just talk a little bit more about what you imagine that might look like.
Children and youth are our future. And with all the brains sitting here with what we think are important, I think we would like that this way of thinking, our thoughts will also be there in the future. And I think that through educating the children and youth, not only about how to read books and how to be interested in science or in other biology or other other topics. I think we as indigenous peoples has a responsibility to also teach our children about our culture, about our history, because throughout the Arctic, Greenland has another history than what Canadian Inuit have, and Alaskans and Chukotkans. And of course, we as Inuit, we are coming from the same people, but we have been, I don't like the word developing. We have been going throughout the history in different and with different conditions from region to region. But said that I think knowledge co-production is something that both Western scientists, but also knowledge holders, and also the indigenous peoples of the Arctic should be educated about. Because I don't think that many in Greenland yet know about this concept. We have heard about the traditional ecological knowledge, but people can't really tell what it is all about. Likewise, the Western scientists, they have had a very hard time in understanding this concept. But by knowledge co-production and the indigenous by bringing indigenous knowledge into this co-production rather than traditional ecological and environmental knowledge, I think that we will find a lot more common spaces between indigenous peoples and the science to work together, and in that way bring the results to a higher place than it is today. Is that understandable?
We have time for one more question before we break.
Your presentation, really interesting. One point that you mentioned that's quite interesting is this idea about communities themselves applying for funding and accessing funding and being in charge of a research program and actually almost maybe taking on academics as research assistants. I'm wondering, in your opinion, what kind of obstacles are there to doing that? And have you thought about ways to actually access maybe? I don't know if you're looking to national science, funding through Denmark or at the university or, yeah.
There are
Interested to hear more about that.
different possibilities, and in Greenland we have, for instance, the Nuna Foundation funded by the government, where everybody can apply, and if they present a good project, you don't need to fulfill academic backgrounds or a university as an institution where you are working from, but this little foundation is a good one, I think, to start with. But I think that in the future, like NSF should also make it possible, if it's not already possible today, to get applications like that, and to be more open to cut the academic strings that are very tight today, maybe soften them a little so that others without any academic or background and without any institutional ties to universities and other scientific communities can do applications too.
Jim, can I just make a comment?
Yeah, I'm 100% where you are, and actually, we do. In the Arctic Social Science program, about 30% of the funds in my program are going towards co-production of knowledge, indigenous scholarship into non-academic institution, indigenous serving institutions, which is great. I mean, I'm really excited about that, and I was really excited to hear this talk. No, not to pat on our back, I think that we should see more of it. I think it's really important to build that capacity and to do indeed that. You don't have to have gone through Western academia to have your own ideas about science and to be able to follow those ideas to their natural conclusion, and I think that's great. And I'm really jazzed to hear what you had to say here. It's really super.
Right, well, there's plenty to think about there, and the idea of cutting the ties and retying them in new ways, I think, is a perfect segue into the next set of questions that we're going to do. But before that, I'd like to extend a welcome thanks to you, Lena. Thank you so much.